good first day yesterday? Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. This is my absolute favorite conference. It's worth traveling all the way from Australia to come here. Of the 12 years I've been doing this, I've been at 11 of them, and it's the 8th year that I've been invited to speak. So I really want to thank Kavai and its organizers, not only for putting on a fantastic event every year, but also giving me this great opportunity to stand up here and address this sea of amazing integration experts and enthusiasts. It's very humbling. I also have to say it's a little bit daunting to be the warm-up act for Clemens Vasters, who's coming on for the next talk. Anyway, as you can tell from the title of the slide, this is all about rules. So just for curiosity, how many people like having rules in their life and kind of take comfort in having that framework, just a show of hands, have that. And how many of you are more like free-spirited, where it's like, no, don't tell me what to do. I want that adventure of having things different. Anybody? A few people. Few people, yeah. So rules are good for establishing predictability and consistency, unless, of course, you're talking about the English language, where half the rules, there's more exceptions than there are compliances. It's a wonder that we can actually understand each other. But I would tell you that in terms of businesses, every organization has rules. And those rules basically underpin the logic and behind the policies and decisions that they make and how the business runs. And as a software developer, it's very important you understand those rules and are able to reflect them in the code that you write. Otherwise, the services are not very supportive of the business. So sometimes those rules are very simple. Like, for example, if you're in retail, if you're over 65, we'll give you a discount. If you buy heaps of stuff from us, we'll give you a discount for that as well. Those are rules, and they're very simple. And as a developer, you might say, oh, well, that's really trivial. It's 1 or 2 lines of code for me to write. I'll just build that into my service. And that's true. You can do that. But then invariably what will happen is your boss will come in one day and say, these old geezers are bleeding us dry. We need to cut the over 65 discount down to 5%. And then you might pat yourself on the back and say, good thing I had the foresight to make that percentage a configuration item. So I can just change it in config and I don't have to rebuild all my code. True. But then, sometime later, the boss will come in and say, we're not doing so well in this particular product line. So for the next 2 weeks, we now want a 20% discount, but only if you buy these products. And now you're like, oh, crap. Because I didn't build temporal boundaries into my code. And I certainly didn't build any scoping for any particular product lines. So now I've got to recompile my code, redo the logic, retest it, and redeploy it. And the worst thing is that it's only for 2 weeks. And depending on how I do that, I might have to roll it back afterwards. So this basically underpins a reality that we all have. It's just that things change. Businesses grow, they move, and their business rules are going to change as well. And sometimes the business rules are actually very complex. Like one of our clients was a major bank that decided that they wanted to automate the loan approval process to see if they could get as far as possible without having the application go before a real person. So their integration framework was BizTalk Server, and they had a massive business rules policy with some very complicated rules to determine how the application could progress and where it got routed to. And of course, there's other scenarios too, like just think about the insurance business, and if you're trying to calculate premiums, all of the risk factors that have to be taken into account, and the fact that they will change too when world catastrophes happen and everything else. So the question is, how do you protect your code and your services from those things that need to change and be versatile? And one answer, of course, is a business rules management system, or a BRMS. Now, there's many different products out there that do this, and all of them have architectures that vary a little bit from product to product, but there's essentially the same concepts for all of them. So all of them are going to have a repository for your rules. That's where you store your rules. You're going to have a method of authoring and testing those rules, and also being able to provide the facts that those rules work on. And then you'll have one or more rules engines that know how to extract those rules, and then one or more decision services that actually know how to apply those rules to any given situation, context. And all of that kind of makes up your business rules management system, and then you have your consumers that then consume those decision services. So it's probably best if we work through an example to see how that goes. So here's a very, very simple rule, which is that if you're buying more than $1,000 for us, we'll give you a 10% discount. So if we break down the components, first you have to write the rule and represent it. So you have some sort of a rules composer, and that generates a rule set, which is a collection of rules that are related to each other. And every rule has three tenets to it. It has the facts, which is the data that the rule works on. So in this case, we're talking about the shopping cart, the amount of money in the shopping cart. We're talking about the $1,000 threshold and the 10% discount. Those are all facts that contribute to this rule. And then you have one or more conditions. And a condition basically is something that evaluates the true or false, and it determines whether or not that rule is triggered. And if it's true, for example, in this case, if there is more than $1,000 in the shopping cart, then that triggers one or more actions to occur. And the action in this case is give the customer a discount. So that's how things break down. So what are the benefits of a BRMS? Well, the first is that the underlying premise is that it's faster, quicker, easier, and less expensive to update rules in a rule engine than it is to update the processing logic in your code. Secondly is that when you have those rules in a system like that, it means that they're reusable by multiple applications, so you don't have to keep building that logic into each one of your services. And that also gives you consistency throughout an organization, which is generally considered a good thing. It also gives you visibility because people who want to understand the rules only have to look in one place. And most BRMSs write those rules in a very friendly kind of language that doesn't require highly technical people to understand them. A good BRMS will give you the ability to test those rules independently of your application. Currency is a factor as well, because if it's easy to change the rules, it means you can keep up with the times. So when you have those special 2-week promotions, you can adapt pretty easily to that with your rules engine. And because a rules engine is designed and optimized for executing rules, it's going to do it presumably better than you could probably do it writing in your custom code in each service. And it's also very maintainable. So in the context of a cloud platform, especially in a microservices architecture, there's some debate sometimes about this, because a tenet of microservices is that they should be self-contained. They should contain their own logic and sometimes their own data. So why would you abstract rules out to another service? Well, I think the answer to that, and it varies obviously depending on your architecture and your solution. If you think about the business rules platform as being another microservice, or in reality a collection of microservices, it does what it does best, and that's certainly a tenet of microservices, right? They should do one thing and do it well. And it also makes it reusable across multiple microservices, and ultimately keeps those microservices as microservices and not macro, because you don't have to inflate them with all of that business logic. All the microservices have to do is just contribute the facts and then call the appropriate rule. Now, I think it's fairly important to understand the concept of forward chaining, because most BRMSs will follow this sort of methodology when they're evaluating rules. So with forward chaining, it basically starts with the facts. And there are two kinds of facts. There are long-term facts and short-term facts. So long-term facts are the things that don't change from one instance to another. They're typically parameters that are set by the business or the organization. For example, if you're over 65, then you get a 5% discount. That's a long-term fact, right? The short-term facts are the facts that are contributed to each invocation and can be unique to that. For example, a customer's age. I think if we walk through an example, that will probably help. So let's start with this example of a retail business. So this organization basically has the status for each customer, and that status might be gold or it's not gold. If they're a gold customer, then they get a 5% discount. Now John is a customer and he's not gold, right? So those are two facts, the short-term fact, which is John's status, and then the long-term fact, which is the business identification of gold status and a discount. So when you evaluate those two facts for the first rule, it means that John gets no discount. Poor John. But we're not done yet, because there's another rule as well. So the second rule says that if you're over 65, then you are effectively gold status. That's the long-term rule. The short-term rule in this case is John is 70 years old. So therefore, he is over 65, and therefore, his status should be gold. Now, this is interesting, because we've just changed the first fact that was used in the first rule. So with forward chaining, what you have to do is go back and reevaluate that first rule. So now, John's status is gold, and therefore, he's entitled to a 5% discount. So when you've evaluated all of that at the end, the action is that you give John a 5% discount. Yay, John. Okay, so understanding all those concepts now, let's look at how we have a business rules engine available to us in Azure. And if you were paying attention yesterday, then I think you already know the answer to that. There's two parts to it. First is the authoring and the testing of rules. And that, of course, is answered by the Business Rules Composer, which you got a very brief look at yesterday, but today I'm going to actually show it to you in more detail. And if that looks very familiar to people who've been used BizTalk Server before, you'd be right. It's kind of a rehash of that particular executable. I can tell it's very popular. The other part of it is actually executing the rules once they're created, the rule sets, and that's done with logic apps and functions. So the way that we do this for the Business Rules Composer, it's a standalone executable that you use to basically compose your rules. You can create vocabularies to go along with that. There are built-in ones, but there are ones that you can create yourself. And the purpose of a vocabulary is just to make the expression of the rule a little bit more user-friendly to read. You define your fact sources. And another cool thing about the Business Rules Composer is that you can actually test your rules as well, independently of your applications. Now, can I just see a show of hands of how many people have actually used the Business Rules Composer in BizTalk before? Yep, quite a few. All right, keep your hands up. How many of you actually used it to test your rules after you developed it? A few less. And of those of you who used it, test it, how many of you actually understood the output? Be honest. It's a little bit complicated. We'll try to work through that today. The other part, of course, is the execution of the rules. And what you saw briefly yesterday is that we now have a new Logic App project template. It's very, very similar to the Logic App with custom function, that Bill showed you yesterday in his presentation. But this one has a template specifically for developing rules. And we also have a new Logic App artifact type. So before you had schemas and maps, now you also have rules. And then for the function that gets deployed, that gets created with this template, actually also has the libraries in it to be able to develop your business rule logic. So if we look at this slide that we saw earlier about how things work, let's actually see how Microsoft has solved this problem by overlaying what's happening. So for the Rules Composer, we had the standalone Business Rules Composer. The rule sets that are generated are executed at the Logic App scope level. And the data on which the rules operate, it supports right now XML and .NET class-based facts right now. And then for being able to execute the conditional statements and the logic, we have specific libraries that you can use in your function. So and there's also an added benefit is the vocabulary support that we have in the Business Rules Composer. So with that, it's probably best that we go into a demo. I have to switch my glasses. 2 days before I left for London, I misplaced my bifocals. So. Okay, let me expand that. So this is the Business Rules Composer, which some of you know and love so much. It is mostly the same as what you had in BizTalk. There's a few subtle differences in here. But to start off, we'll look at the Facts Explorer. So the facts is where you introduce those structures that are actually going to contribute to the rules. It's the data that you work on. And you can see that in this sample here, we have a schema. So we're going to have XML-based facts that come into this, which essentially gives a profile for a customer. We also have .NET-based facts as well. And the relevant one here is this class called Contoso Purchase, which contains methods and properties to help calculate the sales tax. The sales tax being based on the, thanks, Mick. I shut down WhatsApp too. I don't understand how that's going through. So this is how you calculate sales tax based on the zip code of the person. We've also got our vocabularies too, and these are the built-in vocabularies that you get with the Rules Composer. So there's a bunch of functions that you can use and a bunch of predicates that can help you define your conditional statements in a more user-friendly language. And then we have the Rules Set Explorer. So in here, we can have one or more rule sets. Now in BizTalk, this used to be called policies. Now it's called rule sets. And a rule set can have one or more versions, and then each version can have one or more rules. And the rules take the format that we talked about before, where you have your conditions and you have your actions. So in this case, the condition is whether the status of the person is gold or not, and the action is if they are, they get a 5% discount. So notice that we're using the XML-based facts here. Same with over 65. Again, if we're using the XML base, if they're over 65, then they get they update their status to gold. And notice that there is an update here. There's a rule for 10 off if their shopping cart contains more than $1,000. And then there's a couple of rules that also involve setting the tax rate. And if you notice, these rules are using the .NET class rather than the schema. So with that, one of the cool features that we can do is we can test our rules. So if I right-click test the version and I go test rule set, the first thing it needs me to do is to actually identify the instance of facts that are actually going to be presented, so it knows what facts it's working on. So for the schema, I have to add an instance of a schema. And I just realized I need to, before I do that, I'm going to minimize this because I want you to see Visual Studio Code behind it. This here in Visual Studio Code is my actual instance XML that I want to feed into this rule set. So I'll just go add test rule set, schema user, add instance, and we'll choose this one, age 70, no discount. Okay. Now, when I actually test this rule, it's actually going to update the input document. So I want you to pay close attention to the status here section where you have gold is false and the discount is 0 right now. When I execute this rule, I hit test, you see the values change. So now because John is 70 years old, he's entitled to the 5% discount you get because his status is updated to gold. So that's the execution. So this is how you can test your rules independently using the Business Rules Composer. So now let's look at how you can actually implement that in code. So this workspace that I have open was generated using the new project template. And I'll just show you how I did that. So I went into Azure, and then with the Logic Apps extension added, I can click this and I can say create new Logic App workspace. Now it doesn't really matter where I save this because I'm not actually going to save it. I don't want to overwrite, so I'll just select that folder and give it a name. We'll just call it demo. But what I want you to see is that here for the workspace types, we have a new one called Logic App with Rules Engine Project, right? Which looks very, very similar to the custom code project that Bill showed you yesterday. But there are some differences, so I can escape that because I'm not going to do it. One of the first things you'll notice is that in the Logic App folder, where we have artifact types, you'll see that we have a new artifact called rules. And that sample rule set there, that XML, is the output that you get from the Business Rules Composer. So when you compose your rules in the Composer, it actually saves it all to an XML file. So you just bring that in. And the really good news is that if you are migrating from BizTalk Server, it is the same format, the same XML that you export from the Business Rules Composer in BizTalk Server. So it's completely compatible with that. The other thing is that in the function, we have sample code that's given to us that actually shows us how to execute the rules engine using the rules engine libraries. So I won't go in detail right now because I'm looking at the time. I've got 7 minutes left. So you can see that that what we're doing is we're using it accepts XML right now. That's the input it requires. It calls the rules engine to execute the rule, and it outputs an output which we then in the form of this, which gives you an XML doc output. And if there's any custom logic or any custom properties that you want to introduce, like a purchase amount in this case, you can add that as well to the output. And here's a sample .NET Facts class that's also included with this workspace. Now, if we look at the actual workflow itself, the actual workflow that you get as a sample is very, very simple. It's only 3 actions, and they basically hard code the XML instance that goes into it. But for the purposes of the demo, I've expanded that a little bit by first accepting the input as JSON. So I have a JSON schema in my logic app that I use. I transform that into XML because right now the rules engine only accepts XML. And we basically call the function with the rule set that we've identified, the schema for the actual fact input, and then the instance of that schema, and any other properties that are relevant. And when the output comes back to that, I've then transformed it back into JSON using the mapper, and then composed a nice looking result that makes it kind of clear. So this is running already. I've got it going. So let's see if we can test this in Postman. So here's my example. Same as before. John is 70 years old. He's not got gold status yet, and he's therefore entitled to no discount. And he's got a purchase amount of $900. And he lives in a preferred zip code. The preferred meaning it gets a lower tax rate. So if I go ahead and invoke that, I should get an output that tells me that now John's status has been elevated to true, and he gets a 5% discount because of that. And his purchase amount is also reduced. It's reduced because of the 5% discount, but he also gets a 10% tax rate because he lives in a preferred zip code. So his total purchase amount is $940. If I change the parameter to say, like, give him another zip code, he should wind up with a higher tax rate, which he does. He's got a 20% tax rate right now. So this is an example of how you can build rules into Azure using the new project definition and using functions and logic apps to execute your rules. Okay. That's pretty much what I wanted to show, so let me go back to my slides. Okay, so because this is in public preview right now, there are a few constraints on it. So the first is that it only supports XML and .NET-based facts right now. So in BizTalk, if you remember, it supported database as well. There is no database support at the moment. It does require a logic app standard, and you'll need to develop your solutions in Visual Studio Code. I don't think you can do this in the portal yet. The good news, as I mentioned before, is you can import your rules policies from BizTalk and use them as they are. That schema format is supported. And another interesting thing, I mentioned that there are multiple versions in your rule sets. By default, the code will execute the latest version of that rule set. But if you wanted to target a particular version, you can do that as well from your code. Now, I'll leave this up here for a couple of seconds, because if you want to get started, if you scan that QR code, it'll take you to the page that tells you how to start using all of this. There are some prerequisites. Obviously, Visual Studio Code with the Logic Apps extension is definitely one of those prerequisites. And you can download, there's a download link in there to get the Business Rules Composer as a standalone executable and to start developing your rules. And if you have any questions or want to provide feedback about this, Harold Campos has given me permission to put his email address out here, so you can reach out to him. I also really want to shout out Harold. He was very, very helpful in getting me to prepare this presentation, so I'm very thankful to him for his support with that. There is a slide with some additional resources on that, and I'm pretty sure these slides will get published somewhere, so you should be able to access those links. And I'm going to take just 30 seconds for a plug. Down in Australia, so Bill Chestnut has started the Integration Down Under. It's a webinar series that we do once a month in an Asia-Pacific friendly time zone. I think it's usually 7 p.m. on the second Thursday of every month. But we also record all the sessions, and there's quite a library of recordings there. And we've regularly had members of the product team come and present. Wagner is one of our panelists on there. And also MVPs and other integration experts. So I invite you to check that out. There's a lot of great content there. And with that, that's my presentation for today. So,